I think will be our final discussion around the Wage Workers Fairness Amendment Act. But before we get to that, I will do a roll call. On my screen, Larry Villegas,
Present.
Andrew Klein.
Present.
Thank you. Zach Hoffman,
Present.
Andrew Karnowski, Alan Karnowski. Wow,
Present.
been that sort of morning. Tracy Javier. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I can see her. She's present. Jennifer McCahill? No, not with us today. Tracy. Did you say that you're here or not? Yes. Okay, she's here. I'm confirming that Tracy is present. So let's go ahead and actually first I see that we have a few names on the WebEx that I do not recognize. Laura and Andrew.
Yes, I work in the director's office at DOES.
Thank you. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, and hi, Andrew. I'm new as well. Is it okay for me to just sit in and listen?
Absolutely. Who are you? Where are you from? Who are you with?
Well, I was a recent tipped worker, so I just wanted to come to the meeting and listen in.
Oh, welcome. Always happy to have tipped workers. Fantastic. So we have been over the past couple of meetings discussing the Tipped Wage Workers Fairness Amendment Act. I see that David and I do not see Peter. Peter was not able to join us today.
I just texted him. He may not, but let me see if I can hold down his side of the fort.
That's all right. Well, first, sorry, formalities. We need to approve last week's minutes. Is there a motion to approve the previous meeting's minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. The minutes are approved. Now, I was able to go through your amendments and your suggested changes, David, but just for Alan, can I start it off with you, please, and just sort of reiterate where we are with the tip portal and how the status of the tip portal relates to the changes that David has suggested for us.
Sure. So the tip portal, we are currently working. We plan to have it hopefully up in production by by the fall of 2022. That's what we've been stating we've been working towards. As I mentioned before, there would be a time period to allow for testing of the tip portal that the payroll providers would be able to test and provide comments and feedback to DOES. So that is something that we plan to do in the future. So the edits to the legislation that the payroll providers have provided would sort of maybe reset where we're at with the establishment of the tip portal should, the DC Council decide to move forward with any changes to the legislation. So that's where we're at currently.
And just to be clear, the tip portal, as it's being formatted now is adhering to the statutes that we've been talking about, 32-1002, 1008, and 1009. Those are the tip portals being formatted to adhere to the law as it's written currently.
Yes, that's correct. There's a documentation, I think, that we've discussed previously that I've stated. It's file format documentation that I know there's been some concerns about. That was for a previous iteration of the tip portal. So when it's ready, we will reissue that file format documentation that will help kind of guide the payroll providers and how we are accepting the reports. And we will reissue that when it's ready.
Sure. Andrew, I see you. I just want to ask one last question. The tip portal, since it has not been implemented, I just want to make clear for the record that the changes that are suggested are changes to the legislation and not necessarily to the tip portal and or enforcement more broadly of this law by DOES. As Mr. Julian, as you see it, the issues that you're having are with the law, not necessarily with the tip portal and or what DOES is doing to enforce the law. Is that correct?
Partially. It is certainly true that one of the fundamental issues we're raising is the fact that the statute has the payroll providers submitting a report that is problematic. The second issue, however, goes to the portal, because from what Alan just said, I think what that means is the previous spec, which has until this conversation of 2 months ago, never been challenged by DOS as not accurate. That spec is not the spec they're now following, but while they were able to release that previous spec, which we responded to, they're not able to give us any information on their current spec. So we don't know whether or not, in addition to the fundamental question of who files what, whether or not, as was true in a previous draft of a spec, there are parts to DOES's plan that are incompatible with systems. So yes to the statute issue, but not yet at all aware of anything from DOES. I understand there will at some point in the not yet to be identified future be an opportunity to test it. Doesn't change, and that's great, but don't understand why we're not talking now.
Got it. Andrew, go ahead, please.
Talking now, I don't understand why we weren't talking a year ago. We were talking, but apparently no one was listening or we were ignored. I mean, I think what I'm hearing is, well, government inertia, we're pretty far down the road. And if changes are made now, then this is going to upset the timeline. Well, why didn't anybody pay attention before? I mean, this is just incredibly frustrating. And I'm very angry. I mean, I just don't even understand why DOES has completely ignored the issues that have been raised for well over 2 years, because I know we had these meetings live before COVID. So I know that it's more than 2 years ago. So to tell us now, well, gee, we plan to roll this out in the fall, and if it's changed, it's going to upset the timeline. Are you serious? I mean, I just don't even understand. I mean, I get government. It's like, okay, we're going down this road and we're going to plow headlong down this road, whether it makes sense or not. But I don't agree with it. I mean, I may understand it and I've seen it, but I'm outraged by it because these issues have been raised. They've been raised. We've had meetings. We've had meetings in the council member's office. We've discussed it here. And 3 months later, we're told, yeah, this is what we're doing. We're going to keep on going right down the road. My motion that I made at the last meeting was tabled, and it is right for consideration at this meeting because it was tabled to a time certain, which is this meeting, and we want to make sure that we consider it before we conclude. Thanks.
Yes, hoping we will do so also. To be clear, your frustration, your outrage from both Mr. Julian, Peter, Andrew, noted, understood, and empathized with. But we are here now, and this is the TIP Workers Coordinating Council. So our charge is to decide whether or not we will support these changes or changes similar to this amendment. I would like to go back to something that Mr. Julian said, which is that this fundamental question of who reports what, right? A large issue that you're having with this statute is that payroll companies are being required to report, and hopefully I'm paraphrasing you correctly, data that they aren't yet equipped to provide. If that's the case, could you please, and just for the sake of time, be as succinct as you possibly can, explain why payroll companies either aren't equipped to do this and or don't have the means to make the changes so that they can report this data. You are on mute, sir. Don't want to miss anything.
Yeah, really. I understand the question. I can answer it in two ways. One, with respect to the capability of the systems to meet the spec of DOES, don't have any idea because the only spec we had is the spec that DOES previously released, but now says is not operative. So unless and until we see what is in the new spec and whether or not it continued as we identified in the old spec, some of the very specific issues, and it's documented. I can't go through them now. It's not in my head, but we did well document what were some of the technical issues that made it impossible based on the previous spec. So that's issue one. Issue two is this whole idea of, and again, this is statutory. This is not DOES. This whole idea that the only reason why in the 2018 amendment or markup they did this was because in that 11th hour, there was distrust being expressed about whether or not the employers could be trusted to file accurately. And so the payroll providers, without being part of the conversation, were somehow identified as a source which, if they supplied the report, that would somehow make it legit. You may recall it initially also required the payroll providers to certify the content of the reports, which they're not capable of doing because they're not on site to audit. So, and I'm trying to be short, part of the issue is the statutory requirement itself, payroll providers report, the details that you're asking about, I'd have to see the new spec to tell you what the compatibility issues are.
Great. So I think that is there is sort of an overarching theme here that suggests that until we know, we don't know what we don't know. Until we see the TIP portal and how it works, we don't necessarily know what its inefficiencies will be, and what sort of burden they cause to any party, whether it's the payroll companies, employees, employers, so on and so forth. And again, I can understand the frustration where you are required to adhere to something and then you aren't allowed insight as to, how you will be required to do so. I can definitely understand that. So I'm going to pause here for a moment and see if there are any outlying thoughts or questions before I sort of move forward with my thoughts. Everybody's cool. Great. I apologize for not looking at this a little bit more closely for our last meeting, but I did get a chance to go through your amendments, Mr. Julian, and one thing I think sort of stood out to me as it relates to the way the code was written and its impact on tipped workers. I think that I've heard you say, at this meeting and others, that the intent of the council was, whether it be wage transparency or, protecting the minimum wage and ensuring that folks are getting paid the minimum wage. But just by my interpretation, that wasn't necessarily the focus of this code. And I'm speaking specifically about 32-1002. I'm not going to read it. You all have it. You can look it up. But essentially, this statute to me reads that it's requiring a payroll company to provide what they call a tip declaration form that explains, that details the amount that a person makes in tips and the amount that a person, let's say, doles out or tips out to other people who are also making tips. The central part of the statute is regarding the tips, the gratuities, those specific monies. To me, this doesn't read anything about whether or not a person is making minimum wage. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because when you're to ensure that someone's making the minimum wage is, I don't know, basic is the best word that I can think of, but it's one sort of very fundamental thing. But for tip workers, the idea that our tips are our tips and they get passed out or doled out or distributed in such a way that we agree to with the employer is a completely different and separate thing. And I think this code goes to ensure that if I'm a tipped worker, I know exactly where my tips came from. I know exactly how much of them I got to keep and exactly how much I passed out to my workers, or excuse me, to my coworkers. And then we can all get together and make sure that those numbers align. But maybe most importantly, this code, I think, ensures that, or attempts to ensure that process and that breakdown is very simple and very easy to understand for the worker. I think that, again, just initially from what I'm reading about your proposal with the tip credit wage statement, it provides that someone is certainly paid minimum wage or at least a minimum wage, but it doesn't provide that breakdown. And again, for a tipped worker, those tips are my tips, and I need to know where they came from. I need to know where they went. And I think there's a disconnect between the way the law was written and what you're suggesting. Andrew, I saw your hand up.
I just want to make sure I have the right site. I thought you said 32-1002.
Correct.
That's a definition section. Is that really the right site? Doesn't shed any light for me.
I think Jared's talking about the edits David made to that specific citation.
Yeah, but I mean, it was cited in support of what the law was intended to do, and I'm not following because it's new.
And I guess my comment would be, I don't share your view on the intent. What you're discussing now is the tipped policy of the restaurant about how tips are collected and how they're distributed. The legislation also had, if I recall correctly, a requirement for the company's tipped policy to be available and submitted to DOES. That goes to your issue, I think, if I understand correctly, about knowing how all tipped money is collected and how it is distributed. That is the tip policy. I just disagree that the intent of this legislation was to ensure, based on that tipped policy, that all tipped employees could see whether or not they received their proper wage. And while I've changed the language from what they had to the tip credit wage statement in the definitions, the result is they still have to show their tipped policy, which gets to your issue. But my issue is I see this statute as responsible for trying to convey to the employee whether or not they got paid properly. And I still believe that. I hear what you're saying. I think it's a separate part of the statute, and it's addressed when the employer has to submit and update its policy to DOES, whether directly or via the payroll provider.
Sure. I think though that the idea of clear and obvious doesn't necessarily come in there, right? So let's say, I'm a tipped worker and I get a wage statement every week or every 2 weeks. I may or may not be diligent enough to make sure that I'm checking it against the tip policy of the restaurant that I'm working at, and then to check that against the idea that the restaurant is submitting said policy to DOES in a timely fashion. I think again that one of the central things for this legislation was to make the distribution of tips clear and obvious. And again, there's a separation between making sure someone gets paid properly and knowing exactly where your tips came from and where they went.
Do you think they're mutually exclusive?
Yes, I do. Simply because if
I'm stunned by that. If you have a policy that's being followed, then wouldn't that mean that the employee would know the policy, as you say, you could check it up, but has to get not just a comment of what the policy is, but the employee has to also receive her specific, how was that policy applied to my last 2 weeks of working, and did I get paid at least the minimum wage? I don't see how you could disconnect the two.
I think that's what the law is asking us to do. So, for example, currently at the restaurant that I work at, every night we fill out a sheet that shows the tips that we put into the pool and then how they get distributed by to various other team members. We write those things down for ourselves so that we can see what we made, what we put in, and what we're taking out. But when we hand that sheet over to the manager, there's no way for us to know necessarily that the exact numbers that went into that sheet are the exact numbers that go out of that sheet unless we go back and check for ourselves. And what I'm suggesting is that if that sheet in the exact same form showed up on our paycheck, it makes it clear and obvious. It doesn't force the worker to go and make sure and check up on their employers. Yes, Zach, go ahead.
I think I'm confused with your reading of the intention of the law, because what you're saying doesn't make a lot of sense when I square it with the staff that I manage does not tip out other staff. So we already fundamentally have a different setup as far as the distribution of tips. And that is true for every other restaurant and bar that exists, because every bar and restaurant does it in a different way, whether it's pooling, whether it's tip outs, whether it's team service, whether it's everybody takes their own individual, whatever the case may be. To have every single one of those variations reflected in a sheet that's standardized amongst companies under the payroll provider feels like I don't know how that makes sense. like to a third party verification of a proprietary, always up for change at the whim of an operator at any moment, but they have to maintain verification processes. That feels like a DOES verification process. You know, you stated you fill out the form, you give it to the manager, and then you have no longer have any control over the numbers. That's understandable, but in the citation, there is a requirement to have the form noted by staff upon hiring and anytime there's a change, and for DOES to have that information on hand, so if any audits are conducted, that they would be able to verify that system. That's where the verification comes from in that situation. I don't see how you could have, even if David said he could verify it, he could. I wouldn't trust that either, because who do you talk to when you submit your payroll that has intimate knowledge of the distribution of tips amongst your operation? I just don't ever think that that would be something that would be trustworthy in the first place. So I'm not really sure that I agree with your reading of the statute. I think we're conflating a couple of different aspects into this singular issue together.
Okay. My statement still stems from the idea of this statute being an opportunity to lift the burden off of workers. So, as a worker who has had his tipped policy at the restaurant changed 2-3 times within a 2 to 3 or 5 or 6 month span, that's frustrating. And to be able to keep up with all of those changes is daunting. And personally, certainly, but also as a representative of tipped workers, if it's more difficult to do so, if the employer has to not just verify and submit that information to DOES, but also collaborate with their payroll reporting team to make sure that when they make changes, those changes are implemented accurately. If it eases the burden of tipped workers, I don't see a problem with that at all. I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the burden is in your context of. So there's, I guess currently as it stands, like there is a requirement for workers to notify the change of the, you know, the operations tip distribution setup. So whether it's been changed multiple times, I mean, that's not illegal as far as I know, if you're notified properly, right? So at every point, you would then have to have a renewed payroll service discussion that would completely change the way they're reporting and how they have to know how the verification works, etc. That I'm not sure where the burden on workers is coming in there. All I see is burden for payroll providers, and with the looming possibility of them not even being able to do it. Then if you don't have payroll providers, then now I have an even more untrustworthy system of checks written by a restaurant that I definitely now don't know are verified, you know, with the breakdowns or whatever. I'm just not sure where you're really coming from in a lot of it.
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
So I think that
Wait, sorry, before you start, can we just, there's someone with background noise that is not on mute before Larry keeps going. Can we just get that cleared up? Thank you. Go ahead, Larry.
hold on, let me just make sure that okay, so what I
You, Larry.
it maybe the background is on me.
We can hear you.
Okay, so what I wanted to share was that fundamentally, we have different people that represent in different industries in this meeting. As a consequence, there will be times like today and the other times where we will not be able to agree on our interpretation of the law and the intention of the law, etc. What I am curious about is to see maybe a sample of from different restaurants in different places how they get reported, how the tips are reported to them, to see how changing the law would actually impact those reports. Because I do agree that if we give employees more to do regarding investigation wages, then we are defeating the purpose. So basically, I would like to see some pay stubs to see what's happening in the industry, because the report that we're getting at OHR is that it is very messy.
Yeah, and so I think maybe we can segue just a little bit. This is something else that I believe it may have been Peter, but it could have been you, David. I'm not entirely sure from our first conversation. But you did talk about sort of the mess, the mud that can come from different wages and different hours, right? So I think there was an example of like one employee who works, as a high hourly employee in the morning and then becomes a server at night. And if that employee goes into overtime, you've got 3 or 4 or 5 different wages plus the tips, and then trying to align the tips with the specific hours. Am I saying that correctly or somewhat close? Wait, mute again. I appreciate your diligence with the mute.
You are properly describing one example of a employee's history in a given week that needs to be managed and properly recorded. Yes, that's
Right.
that's one of many legitimate. This is how people work.
Right. And so I think that, so maybe that as one example of a particular employee, maybe we can talk about this in the same breath where Zach is mentioning, there are all sorts of different types of restaurants, right? There are fine dining places that have pooled houses. There are casual places where you take what you make, you get tipped out in cash, or a bar where the bartenders make pool, but the servers do not. And the restaurant industry is eclectic. It's not like, an attorney's office where everybody but a few make, a salary that just is plugged in by an accountant every week or 2 weeks. It is a industry that each individual business has to do what's best for its employees within the style of business that they're doing, right? However, it's my opinion that standardizing some of this, whether it's enacting this where payroll companies who are a bit more regimented can say, if you make such and such change to your tip policy, then that's going to require many of these different changes, would make the industry, at least in my opinion, again, more stable for the workers. Similarly, if, I don't know, just imagine a world where everybody's paid the same wage. And then if you get tips, you get tips. And if you don't, you don't. That I think would make this a little bit easier on the payroll providers, given if this legislation is enacted. Thoughts there?
The second scenario that you described is what was explicitly rejected by the council under the law that we're talking about.
Yeah, maybe it should be.
Well, but that's not.
That's not your decision to make, Jared. That's
No, of course not. Of course not. I just said maybe.
And nor does it eliminate any of the discussion about tips in any meaningful way, because tips would still exist, and we're not talking about What you're talking about is not whether you're making the full minimum wage. What you're talking about is the reporting of tips on a payroll tip stub. So nothing changes in your latter scenario. That's exactly how Andrew described. So I don't know that that was necessary or appropriate to bring up.
Can I,
Please.
let me try something here. Clearly, the last 3 meetings of this group, and thank you for the ability to participate, have shown that I think if there's one thing that everybody, regardless of the perspective that they're bringing, can agree on is this seems kind of screwed up. And this seems like left hand and right hand and impacted parties aren't all aware of what's going on. It is also documented, Andrew raised this earlier, that for the last 2 years, including today, every effort to say to DOES, yo, understand the language in the statute. Now you tell us the spec, okay, why can't we sit down and hear what you're trying to do so that we know it's going to work? So far for 2 years, DOES has clearly said, no, we're not going to do that. And they said it again today. When we're ready, we will tell you, here's our program, go test it and see what happens. So they're not going to respond to us. Well, certainly they're not responding to the payroll providers. Doesn't this belong at the council? Isn't this something that we should take back? We, all the impacted parties, should take back to Council Silverman's committee and say, look, we can't get DOES to talk to us about either why we think some of the statutory language should be at least reconsidered, because here are the implications. That's my issue about the statute, not DOES, saying that it's who does what. But at the same time, we've now seen that when you get into the weeds on this, and by the way, clarify the intent, is it what it is? It seems to me we need the authority of the council, that DOES would have a lot more trouble saying, no, we aren't ready to talk to you yet. And I think the party that's missing here is the council that has the ability to bring DOES to the table. Let them hear what we're saying about both statutory issues as well as the details. And let that be the forum from which some action can be taken. Maybe it's a statutory change along the lines that the payroll providers have proposed. Maybe it's tweaking as it was done in 2018 when they got rid of the word certify. They've already recognized that there are things they did in 2018, language that they used, certify, that was inappropriate, and they changed it. The problem was, at the very beginning, the impacted parties were not all at the table. So let's fix it.
Alan, did you have something? Not really? Okay.
I mean, I agree with that. In the absence of DOES being transparent as to what they're doing, and I just don't understand why that's not happening. I don't understand how we can be here as the Tip Worker Coordinating Council, and this project is going to move on down the road, and DOES is going to say to us as the Tip Worker Coordinating Council, no, we're not going to tell you. We'll tell you when we're good and ready. And I just don't understand that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Why are we on this commission? Why are we wasting our time if DOES is not even going to share with us what they're doing? Now, we might, individually agree or disagree with what they're doing, agree or disagree with their interpretation of the statute, agree or disagree as to how they're implementing, whether it makes sense for workers or employers. But we can't even do that if we don't have the information. And DOES says, we're not going to tell you, we're not ready. We'll wait. We'll spend more money. And we're going to try to get this thing down the road so that government inertia will take over. And then they'll say, we've already spent the money. What do you mean? We've already done it. So, what, you're going to question it now? I mean, that's what's going on here. It's obvious. They don't want to tell us because they want to get so far down the road. They're committed to doing it the way that do it, and maybe they're doing it right. I don't know. But I don't know because we're not being provided the information and they're not being transparent and it's wrong. And if it takes the council and a committee public hearing where everyone can be heard and DOES can be called in and say and asked, like, what are you doing? Then that seems appropriate.
Yes, Tracy, go ahead.
Is there like a legal issue of why we can't just see maybe like even like a wireframe of the tip portal? So, because I just feel like we're all kind of talking about we want what we object to, but we also don't know exactly like what the tip portal is. So it's very hard to like come to an agreement or even just a transparent disagreement without knowing what we're really looking at.
So I think I've said it many times that when we have something that we can share, we will share it. When the system's ready to test, it will be tested by the payroll providers or those that are required by the law to submit these reports. I mean, I don't know what else you want me to say.
Well, Alan, when you say when we have something we can share, who or what determines what you can share?
Well, the fact that our vendor is working on this and the vendor has requirements based on the statute to build out this system. And when they have an updated file format documentation that's ready to be shared, that's what will be shared.
So are you suggesting that there's some measure of confidentiality that the vendor has to abide by based on being contracted by the mayor's office or DOES?
I'm not saying it's confidentiality. I'm just saying it's the file format documentation is not ready. And when it's ready, it will be shared.
What about the specs that were
About the spec that was used that was given to your contractor.
The specs that are based on the statute that is public and that we've all discussed and seen.
Well, I don't know. We don't know whether their specs are based on the statute or not. That's the point.
That's what I've said multiple times. That's what I've said multiple times. The specs are based on the statute, and I put that in writing to you all months ago. We're abiding by the law and we're building out the portal based on what is required in the law.
Alan, is it true that the specs are, Andrew, excuse me, Alan, is it true that the specs that you have provided to your contractor have more details and more specificity than the language in the statute? Or did you simply identify and pull from the statute language in the statute and that alone is in the spec? I know the answer to this question. We all know it. The spec has more details in it than the statute, right or wrong?
That's not true.
Okay.
I don't know what specs you're looking at, David. But
we haven't seen them. You won't share them. We want to see the specs. I think that's
so you're saying you haven't seen the specs, but now you're saying the specs are wrong. So which one is it?
No, I didn't say the specs are wrong. All I said was the specification information that DOES has provided to the contractor has more details and more specificity than simply copying and pasting language from the statute. And I'm not saying you did it right. I'm not saying you did it wrong. I'm saying we haven't been allowed to see that detailed specification, which I'll bet $1 to a donut has more words in it than what you find in the statute. But I will put the dollar up.
Okay, but if there's nothing we can do but take Alan at his word, or is there?
There is.
Chairman, I make a motion that we formally request that the director of DOES attend the next tip worker coordinating council and make it a utmost priority for this council to hear from her directly.
I'll second that and would ask that you accept as a friendly amendment to your motion that the director be informed to be prepared to address the specifications that were given to the vendor and provide those to us.
Yeah, that's an accepted amendment.
Sure, I have no problem doing that. Sorry, I'm just taking a look at my notes quickly. Um, if that's the case, then I'm afraid I don't think we will get to vote on this today as we plan to. I would suggest though that we, depending on the director's schedule, reconvene as soon as possible, hopefully within 7 business days, but that'd be tough.
Just so we're clear, is the motion that Mr. Hoffman made passed as amended?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you meant.
Well, we didn't vote on the motion. We had a motion, we had a second. It seems like
Oh, sorry.
that's
correct.
okay.
Let's have a vote then. All in favor of Mr. Hoffman's motion that the director of DOES attend the next meeting so that we can ask the specific questions about the specs in the tip portal. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Ayes as I count them. All opposed? None opposed. Fantastic. We will schedule another meeting, hopefully, like I said, very shortly, and get some of these final questions answered.
I move to table my existing motion until our next meeting.
I will second that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Fantastic. The ayes have it. All right. Thank you again for your time. Any final thoughts, questions? We all know where we stand? Perfect. Thank you to those of you from the public that joined us. I've said it before, but I say it again. I love members of the public to join. So if you and or anyone else would like the schedule of the date, of course, it is posted on the mayor's website, but feel free to contact me directly to make sure you get that. Thank you very much.
Have a
You
good
all
day,
have a great
everyone.
afternoon.
See you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Oh, meeting's adjourned. I don't know if I'm supposed to do that or not. Sorry. Bye.